today's video, I'm trying out the Speedball Superblack India ink with brushes. I've had Superblack before, but I've mostly used it with dip pens and with some brushes in the past. However, I haven't been able to find my dip pens since 2019, so I recently had to reorder them. The price was very good for all this ink, and I got it in with my Christmas presents. With shellac in it, it's not alcohol proof, so you can clean it up with isopropyl alcohol, especially if you get stuck on surfaces like brushes or your hands, but it is waterproof when dry, so you can use it and plan the layering accordingly with wet media. But also remember, if you use it with alcohol markers, it will bleed with them, so you might have to put it on top of the dried marker, not underneath. Very advised. I start with the pure black here that I placed in that pan. I'm adding more water to the brush without fully rinsing it off to show a wash. These brushes here are set aside specifically for ink, and I only use them for ink because India ink can damage the brush very much. I have separate brushes for acrylic paint, watercolors, and ink. I also use watercolor brushes with gouache. I use a separate jar to prevent cross-contamination. I don't want trace amounts of shellac to get in with my watercolor paints, for example. Here I use 4 different half-pan wells, adding more water as we go along. So it's the pure black ink on the far left and very watered down on the far right to create different levels of wash. This can be used with a brush or a dip pen to get different shades of gray in with this ink, as you can see here. With such a large bottle of ink as well, I can feel safe to do as many ink paintings and pictures and inking as I wish without worrying about running out of the supply. The entire bottle is also very affordable. It was $15.99 before tax, which is $18.38 in Canada after tax, which makes it 3.8 cents per milliliter. So I'm quite happy with the price. Here I'm just doing a few freehand little animals, testing out the ink as I haven't really used it for a while. I used to use this sort of ink more, and I used to use the dip pens fairly often until I misplaced them and they went missing back in 2019. I've also shaken up all my other old ink bottles so that I can get ready to use them again, and I'm hoping to get the new dip pens in the mail sometime soon. Here I'm using a very thin brush to basically sketch directly in the ink. I'm mostly using the very dark ink here and being quite bold. Something to keep in mind is that you can't really erase, but you can also make corrections digitally after the fact. So if things aren't absolutely perfect in the traditional media, but you are going to scan it and use it from a digital version, you can make corrections there. It is also possible to use very thick opaque whites like acrylic paint or very white opaque ink to make some corrections on white paper. If you're trying to make an original artwork, originally with the ink, however, it is probably a very good idea to try to be very careful and to make as few mistakes as possible. As this is just a little test and I'm getting back in shape with using such things, I'm not going to stress about it. I'm using the lightest shade here to just do some fine sketching as well as to shade in some areas with some tone. It's a very good idea to sometimes use more permanent media to do sketches in your sketchbook or even final pieces without overthinking it, because sometimes we can get locked into overthinking things, and other times it's a good idea to take your time and think about it a lot. I think variety is a good way to go about art. That's why I also like to use mixed media and lots of different papers. Another factor is the paper itself. As with all media, each paper will react differently. Here's an example of a different paper. This is a thin tone tan craft paper sketchbook from Dollarama I got many years ago. I haven't found them there since 2018. I believe the last one I got was in 2018, so I don't know if they have them anymore. They haven't had them anywhere I've been since 2018, but I'd love to get more because I absolutely love these sketchbooks. Still, I'm going to use them rather than hoarding them for some mysterious day. As you can see, the ink does work differently on this paper. The tone of the paper shines through the ink, adding a base color. I could also go on top with other colors and different media once I'm done this as well. But this is just a quick example of me using up that extra ink so it doesn't dry and get wasted. Now this is Procreate. I did an initial sketch of the base for this character in a sketchbook. I then photographed it and put it into Procreate. In Procreate, I'm working out the sketches of the ideas for this, and then I'm going to print it back out very lightly and go over it with traditional ink. This is a picture I'm working on for the coloring book I'm working on. I'm probably going to use the digital version in the final coloring book, though I did scan and correct the traditional art version I make in a moment. As you can see, I've printed it out on very smooth Bristol. I use Strathmore smooth Bristol because I find it to be very superior for ink and brush techniques. I still think you can use inferior papers, but you do have to adjust your technique. Rough papers also will damage nibs of dip pens, so be careful for that. Smooth papers are better for the nibs of delicate pens. You also have to be careful for the nibs of other sort of things like markers and fine liners, which can be damaged by some rougher papers. When it comes to watercolor paper, it's very thirsty, so it absorbs extra ink as well. So be aware that you will use extra ink, whether it's alcohol marker ink or these sort of dip inks. It does use up extra ink when you're using very watercolor based paper. I'm a little out of practice, but the real reason why I don't think I did a perfect job here is more because I didn't have my dip pens, which I would have preferred to use in some of the cases in this, as well as these brushes not being the absolute most perfect pointed brushes. But I think it was really more because I was rushing. I was trying not to film too much because it takes up space on my iPad, and the video would take up more data and space and storage if it was a longer video file. So I was rushing the process here. I advise when you're doing your own pictures like this, don't do that. The other thing is I was having trouble being able to see as clearly, whereas for some of the fine details I really should have been leaning my head right in, but it would have blocked the camera, so I couldn't do as good of a job while filming. Another reason that I didn't do quite as good of a job, that I don't think you should do when you're doing this sort of thing at home, is that I didn't turn the paper. It's much more preferable for your wrist and the quality of your work to turn the paper to an ideal angle for your wrist to smoothly move through the motions. I think that off camera I can do a much better job, but it's not as good for filming to take a little too much time, and it's not as good for filming for me to turn the page or to lean right in and get the top of my head to block the camera. So filming really does actually make this sort of stuff harder to do very well. I should also say that I looked at various references and did research in order to do this design in the first place, including looking at Art Nouveau and various images of birds and women. I also referenced ancient Egyptian clothing to help me design the sort of clothing she's wearing, although I didn't make myself stay to ancient Egyptian clothing specifically. It was just an inspiring starting point for this fantastical design. I definitely want to have thicker lines around the outlines of things and thinner lines on the inside. A lot of the thinner lines aren't as high quality as I'd prefer, and some of the thicker lines are a little off as well. But like I said, for all the reasons I gave earlier, the quality on this isn't quite as high as it would have been. I wasn't sure when doing this whether or not I was going to use the shades of gray on it, whether I was going to bring it back in and film doing tones after scanning it from my computer. But as the video was getting more than long enough, I decided I had to stop at just black and white. I'll ask you to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell if you're really enjoying my content. The clear sheet is something else I got for Christmas. It's a piece of Duralar, which is very good for the fact that it puts a barrier between your skin oils and possible dirt on your hands and any transfer, but it still allows you to see the art underneath, and it's quite a good material for that purpose. I got it for some other purposes as well, but that's a separate video. Not sure what order I'm going to post these in, so I better assume it could be either or. I'm getting all little individual feathers here. It's not really a big difference that I'm inking over a already printed image, which is an artwork I did by hand anyway, versus if I'm inking over my pencil lines. It's the same thing. You're tracing over the guidelines you yourself made. In the case of a printing like this, I cannot erase the pale gray lines, but in the case of inking over your direct pencils, you can erase the lines. I advise you lighten, using a kneaded eraser, the original lines that you do in pencil before inking them, so that they're not too dark, so that they're easier to erase later. Letting the ink set and dry into the page for a length of time is also advised before erasing any pencil underneath, which I also advise you do after waiting. I advise waiting 8 hours or simply overnight before erasing the pencil underneath in the case of inking directly on the original pencils. As I said, certain papers are even more ideal for inks, although they're often labeled that way, but I do find that the ink works rather well on absolutely every paper, so I can advise you do so. I like to use the wrong paper, quote unquote, for various media and force it to work by learning the best way of using every paper through trial and error and literally taking notes as well. There are still superior papers, such as this smooth Bristol, as well as other smooth papers. Very smooth cardstocks are also really nice to use ink on as well, but each paper varies and you'll have to test it out yourself. What techniques you prefer, the way you work with mixed media or even just one media like just ink alone, and the style your art is in might affect this, and as well trying to preserve art materials and not have them damaged. Rough papers damage nibs, for example, as I stated earlier in the video. All these cutaways where you see it coming back is when I set the picture aside to completely dry for at least 15 minutes. In a lot of cases I waited longer because it was a fairly humid day when I originally did this, so I waited sometimes more than a half hour between different sessions where I sat back down and recorded doing this again. I think I actually did it over the course of 2 days altogether, and I made sure to get most of it. There's one section where the lens wasn't working properly because I accidentally smudged the lens of the camera here, which is actually the camera on my iPad, and then I had to clean it off. So there's a small section that didn't get recorded, but it's very small. And almost the entire process was recorded here. I stop inking when I think I'm going to smudge the wet ink, and I set it aside to dry. Try to work upper left to lower right if you're right-handed, or upper right to lower left if you're left-handed, to avoid touching the wet ink. The entire process is very focused on, first of all, doing a good job, but that good job also includes not touching where there's wet ink. Remembering where you just put wet lines and trying to make sure you don't cause any smudges at all is obviously something to aim for. But there is opaque white that can erase on the original artwork, and it is possible, of course, to correct things digitally. Don't be afraid. Sometimes you need to be bold, even if it's hard to correct mistakes. It's a very good art media, an ancient one, and quite light fast. I highly recommend it. Here's the final look at the inked image. Once again, that's all for this video. If you like my videos, please remember to like, subscribe, and turn on that notification bell to all notifications so you will know when a new video comes up. I aim for new videos every Wednesday, but sometimes life happens and things are delayed. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you with another one very soon.